It's a beautiful drive there in the woods.
I just look at that.
He's like a puppet. It's like a kid. I wasn't going to be, maybe, that's like really.
To be respectful of your time, and I know that some people aren't able to stay for the entire, all the presentations. It is a little after 6, so we'll go ahead and get started. So I want to welcome you to the second night of our conference, Speculative Americas, where we'll have 2 panels. And I just want to say, in terms of reflecting a little bit on our first night, what really struck me were the very personal connections that you all are making to the course material. I think this has come out through our class discussions. And so I look forward to tonight's presentations. And of course, I didn't bring the program up. Our first presenter is Mary, and the panel name is, someone help me out. This is the Bad Kids. Thank you. Bad Kids, the representation of children and traumatic childhoods. So Mary, just remember, let's see, we'll share your screen. And that. So it's not in the way. And then, you can put it in the slideshow mode. Okay. Do I have to wait for the timer to start?
No.
Okay.
It's starting.
All right. So, hello, I think everyone in here knows me, but my name is Mary, and I am presenting my research paper called Seen and Not Heard, Child Dehumanization in Contemporary American Literature. For this research paper, I took an interest in the portrayal of children in contemporary American fiction. So in 3 of the novels we read for class, those being Future Home of the Living God, Red Clocks, and Our Missing Hearts, I noticed a trend of the children in these novels being treated or portrayed in dehumanizing ways. Oh, no, that's not supposed to do that. So this made me wonder how this dehumanizing portrayal of children in contemporary American literature connects to contemporary American society's view of children and how these 2 spaces influence each other. With these ideas in mind, I will argue that these novels reflect and respond to contemporary Americans' belief that the child, though a beloved figure and symbol in American culture, does not exist as a person. As a result, the authors of these novels demonstrate the ways in which child idealization, objectification, and weaponization manifests consciously or unconsciously in contemporary American fiction. Some scholars have talked about how children are dehumanized in the real world, and others have discussed how children are depicted in literature. However, I've seen very few people discuss the feedback loop that occurs between the real and literary worlds. And because of this gap in research, I believe I offer a unique perspective on this topic. So, what is child dehumanization? So I want to, before I jump into my research, I want to explain how I'm defining and categorizing child dehumanization. So for this paper, I will be focusing on 3 main aspects of child dehumanization: idealization, objectification, and weaponization. Idealization refers to the idea that children are perfect and innocent beings rather than real, flawed human people. Objectification refers to the belief that children must be subjected to the whims of adults regardless of their opinions or needs. And this form of dehumanization often manifests in treating the child as a tool or accessory rather than as a person, and largely ignores that children will not be children forever. Weaponization refers to the usage of children to accomplish a goal, usually of the political variety. In total, child dehumanization occurs when a child receives any of these treatments and is thus not regarded as fully human or fully deserving of human rights. And since my paper tackles both the literary world and the real world, we'll first explore the prominence of each form of dehumanization in American society, followed by a close reading of the texts. So first, we're going to talk about idealization. So in her article, The Rush to Motherhood, Pronatalist Discourse and Women's Autonomy, Diana Teijens-Myers shows off the ways that the idealized child pervades American society. Specifically, she focuses on how American society glorifies children and motherhood mostly because American society can't fathom not wanting children. She writes, the concept of family planning does not include refusing to have children, which sounds like blasphemy in an era of pietistic pronouncements about family values. If not wanting children is blasphemous, then the child becomes a godlike, mythic, inhuman figure. There's no consideration for the child as a person with human flaws, just as an ideal. Myers thus proves the existence of the idealized child in American society. So now that we've established the prevalence of child idealization in American society, I want to show how child idealization shows up in each of the three novels that I mentioned. I'll start with Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God. In this novel, the concept of the idealized child is believed in and perpetuated by Cedar, the story's protagonist. Cedar is a pregnant woman living in an America where the government kidnaps pregnant women to experiment on them and their babies. Despite this, Cedar is happy to have a child and consistently maintains her belief that this child will be perfect. She says that everyone will be overjoyed to see her child as he is the light of the world. Cedar views her child as so perfect that hating him would be impossible, thereby idealizing him. In writing this idealization in a positive way, Erdrich endorses this view of the child as an ideal. Next, let's move on to Leni Zumas's novel Red Clocks. Unlike Erdrich, Zumas subverts child idealization in her novel. A major example of this comes from two of her main characters, Ro and Susan. In the American society depicted in Red Clocks, single people are banned from adopting children thanks to a law called Every Child Needs Two. Ro, who struggles with fertility issues, wants to adopt a child, but can't because she's single. Susan, on the other hand, has two children. Since Ro doesn't have any kids, she imagines having an idyllic life with her theoretical child. She imagines the child as a perfect being who acts exactly how she wants to. While this imagining of the child makes no room for children as imperfect people, Susan, as a stay-at-home mom, knows exactly how imperfect children can be. At one point in the novel, she becomes so overwhelmed by her son's temper tantrum that she hides from her children and eats candy, an experience that demonstrates the less romantic parts of having children. Zumas, through Ro and Susan, reminds the reader that children will never restrain themselves to the ideals their parents want them to uphold. The idealized child features prominently in Celeste Ng's Our Missing Hearts as well. In this novel, under the rule of the fictional Preserving American Culture and Traditions Act, or PACT, Americans are required to be sufficiently patriotic lest their children be taken away. The United States justifies this rule by arguing that it is necessary to protect a child from learning such harmful views. In this book, as in Future Home and Red Clocks, adult society views children as wholly innocent and pure. Politicians and civilians alike agree that the child is too pure to be exposed to such supposedly dangerous behavior and must therefore be brought to a safer environment. In this dystopian society, the child is reduced to an ideal and is thus stripped of their personhood. Through her depiction of this society, Ng demonstrates the dangers of viewing children in this idealized way. Oops, no. So next, we're going to talk about child objectification in American society. So in their article, Are Children Oppressed? The Timely Importance of Answering This Question, authors Richard P. Barth and Amanda N. Olson explore the United States' contemporary history of objectifying children in legal spheres. At one point, they talk about how the United States has not signed the 1989 UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or the CRC, which in part advocated for the ban of corporal punishment. America has not signed this document, principally due to objections to the corporal punishment ban. The United States, in not signing the CRC, has legally cemented the child's position as property of their parents and likewise as an object. Given this constant exposure to child objectification, it is subsequently plausible that Americans have unconsciously fallen victim to this objectifying mentality. Future Home of the Living God, Cedar undeniably objectifies her child. Her world is dangerous both for herself and for her unborn child, but when people express hope that she miscarries, Cedar feels resentment over the fact that nobody but me appreciates the baby's presence here on Earth. Cedar's insistence on bringing this child into this dangerous environment demonstrates her lack of consideration for her child as a human being that will grow up and endure the struggles this new world presents to him. Yet Erdrich does still criticize child objectification through the government. This government experiments on children to save humanity, a choice which shows their view of the child as an object, since there's no consideration for the children's futures or desires. Erdrich criticizes this objectification when it is done by the government, but not when it is done by the mother. In this way, she echoes contemporary America's belief that children are property of their parents. Though Leni Zumas subverts child idealization in Red Clocks, she unconsciously endorses child objectification. Like with Future Home of the Living God, much of this objectification comes from Rose and Zumas's lack of consideration for Rose's potential child's future quality of life. As Rose herself admits, she is in massive debt and struggles to support herself on her teacher's salary, but she insists on trying for a baby. The child's future doesn't factor into Rose's decision to force this child into the world. She simply wants a child and therefore will have one, transforming the child into an object to be desired and owned. Though, like Erdrich, Zumas believes this right to objectification only extends to the parent. When the government restricts single people from adopting, Rowe points out the flaws of this law, recognizing that now many children may not be adopted. In this way, the government doesn't acknowledge how this law will affect real children's lives. In criticizing child objectification while still partially endorsing it, Zumas demonstrates how contemporary American authors can internalize these objectifying beliefs even as they try to fight them. Celeste Ng is the only author of the three to fully subvert child objectification in her novel, mostly through the way her fictional American society objectifies children. As previously mentioned, one of the biggest justifications the government provides for PACT's existence is that it protects innocent children from being exposed to dangerous ideologies. Yet though this society claims to be working with children's futures in mind, it effectively objectifies them through its policy of removing children from homes deemed to be unpatriotic. This removal negatively impacts the children removed, an impact that can be seen most clearly through 13-year-old Sadie, who was removed from her parents as a young girl after they voiced unpatriotic ideas. Sadie is bounced from foster home to foster home, becoming angrier and more jaded each time she is moved. She loses the childish innocence that her society wants to protect, all while losing any sense of stability. Her society doesn't consider how removing children from their families will affect individual children, only that this law will theoretically protect the child. Through this use of PACT, Ng satirizes American society's objectification of the child. I lastly wanted to discuss the prominence of child weaponization in American society and its impact on American literature. In her article, A Hierarchy of Innocence, the Media's Use of Children in the Telling of International News, Susan D. Moeller examines the media's use of the child to influence Americans' beliefs about the world. She finds that the media uses the sympathetic image of children to gain support for or outrage against various public and political issues, writing that the shilling of public policy issues by using images of children is a familiar tactic. The child therefore thereby becomes a weapon with which to sway public opinion. Though Erdrich, Zumas, and Ng don't always align in their portrayals of child dehumanization, each of these authors takes a clear stance against child weaponization. Louise Erdrich portrays this weaponization through her fictional government's use of babies against their mothers. As I mentioned, the government captures pregnant women to experiment on them and their babies. This dehumanizes the babies, but it also makes the women intensely vulnerable as they're subject to the whims of the people in charge. In this way, the women become just as dehumanized as their children are. Not only are these women's safety at risk for being pregnant, but their safety is also placed second to the safety of their children, stripping them of power and agency. Thus, Erdrich demonstrates the ways in which a child can be made a weapon against their mother. The weaponization of the child also features prominently in Red Clocks, especially because of the Every Child Needs Two law. On its surface, this law is intended to restore dignity, strength, and prosperity to American families, but there's no denying the controlling effects this law will have on American citizens. If the American government wants more people to fulfill their ideal of the nuclear family, this law is the perfect way to mandate this family under the guise of helping children reap the rewards of growing up in a two-parent home. For potential parents to adopt children, they must get married. The safety of the child becomes the justification for this governmental overstep, and the image of the child is weaponized to protect these so-called family values. Zumas, in this way, exhibits how political forces can weaponize children to enforce social norms. Of the three authors, Celeste Ng's stance against child weaponization is most overt. She uses PACT in its predominant focus on the child to decry this weaponization. PACT is obviously oppressive since it erases citizens' right to protest, but most people go along with it thanks to its protect the child marketing. On their own, the American people would likely stand against any law that denied them the right to free speech. But if they're pacified with visions of safe and happy children, they'll view PACT only as a necessary evil. And even if someone does see the flaws in this act, they have to go along with it or else risk losing their children. The American government featured in Our Missing Hearts manipulates the image of the child both to justify its restriction of its citizens' rights and to shut down those who see through their lies. Ing therefore uses PACT to show her readers how accepting the image of the child as an ideal and an object can make them vulnerable to attacks on their rights. In effect, these three authors provide evidence of the cyclical relationship between fiction and reality. If the real world continues to dehumanize children, the literature will follow suit, and if literature treats children as non-humans, readers will as well. Those in both spheres must thus, as each of these authors agree to achieve to some degree, work to eradicate child dehumanization in literature and in life. And, hello, bibliography, and we're done. You want me to X out of this or?
You can, you can, or stop share.
Yeah.
And then. No, that's okay. And if you need help.
It's good like this, right?
Yeah. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Hi, I'm Jess Hecht, and today I will be speaking to all of you about how childhood trauma affects adults, specifically in the novels Gold Famed Citrus by Claire Vaye Watkins and Red Clocks by Leni Zumas. There we go. So first, a little summary of both of the novels. Gold Famed Citrus is a piece of climate fiction that has some science fiction elements in it as well to serve as a warning for what could happen to the world if climate change continues on and humans do not change their ways. Luce Dunn, the protagonist, was born into a world where climate change was nearing its zenith. California has become an uninhabitable, drought-laden wasteland. She was used as a poster child by her father after she was born to combat the coming apocalyptic events that will result from the climate changing so drastically. On the other hand, we have Roberta Stevens, aka Ro, who is faced with a patriarchal, paratopic version of the United States, where single parents will not be legally allowed to adopt children in just a few months' time. Ro is desperate to procure a child before that deadline arrives. Even though Luce and Ro's individual struggles are quite different in nature, and they are at different stages in life, with Luce being in her mid-20s and Ro being in her 40s, Zumas and Watkins show through their writing that Luce and Ro have the same underlying context for their troubled mental states, the awful experiences of their youth. But before we delve into specifics, let's start by asking a question. What is trauma? According to Isaac Yocha's article titled Long-Term Psychological and Physiological Consequences of Trauma in Childhood Revisited, he explains that trauma occurs when the mind and brain are unable to cope physiologically and psychologically with an overwhelmingly shocking event or events. Though trauma can manifest in many different ways, the root problem tends to be the same for most suffering from traumatic experiences. Usually, trauma can be traced back to some form of abuse, causing a mental wound to open up in the victim's mind. A side effect of the traumatic event is that without proper psychological counseling, the event can become a mental ball and chain that is dragged around by the victim, impeding their daily life potentially for the rest of their lives. When it comes to trauma, excuse me, when it comes to trauma that is inflicted during childhood, Yocha confirms that trauma inflicted upon children is very different from the effects of trauma in adulthood. This is due to the familial nature of trauma that is inflicted during childhood. Most, if not all of the abuse, is caused by someone close to the child, such as a parent, relative, or any other adult in the child's life. And that is why the trauma that manifests in childhood is so different than when trauma is experienced in adulthood. Even though a traumatic event could happen to anybody at any stage of life, there was a particularly horrible set horrible side effect of being traumatized as a child. It completely rewrites the child's brain chemistry and how they perceive and interact with the world. This result is because of the strong relationship children have with those whose responsibility is the welfare, both mental and physical, of the child. These children are being attacked, abused, and berated by the people they care about the most. And since they are receiving hate instead of love from these important people in their lives, the resulting trauma is disastrous, as it can last an entire lifetime. When trauma occurs as an adult, the impact, though quite severe, isn't as crippling because adults don't tend to be as emotionally attached to their abusers as children. Whereas children typically rely on their abusers for everything, including food, water, shelter, clothing, emotional support, and safety. Next, I'm going to talk about some of the most common causes of childhood trauma. Though the concept of trauma is myriad in nature, there are a few common causes that affect children in particular. Some of these examples include exposure to drugs and/or alcohol, parental neglect, and abuse, whether it be mental, physical, and/or sexual in nature. Due to the fact that parents have virtually complete control over their children, that makes it extremely easy for parents to exploit their children for monetary gain in the form of poster children and child stardom, although another relatively new form of abuse. Though parents tend to be the ones responsible for traumatizing children, it does not necessarily have to be a parent who is responsible. The perpetrator or perpetrators could be other family members, such as an aunt, a grandfather, a teacher, a religious leader, a coach, or any other person who can exercise any form of authority over a child. Now, I would like to focus on the first of the two characters I will be analyzing, Ro from Red Clocks. Ro loses her older brother to a drug overdose, and this tragedy shakes her entire world. She is constantly looking for a clean slate, so to speak, as a way to rewrite over her awful past with a fresh coat of paint. Robert A. Lewis explains in his article, The Family and Addiction, an Introduction, that not only does having a family member who is using drugs regularly pose a danger to the child by threatening the proper development of their hippocampuses, but it is quite likely that whatever addictive behavior the family member possesses could easily be passed on to the child. Though Ro herself never develops an addiction to drugs or alcohol, she does indeed develop an addiction, having a baby at any cost necessary. Instead of the constant craving for drugs or alcohol, she perpetually hears her biological clock ticking, causing her to become more and more manic in her quest to obtain her heart's desire, going so far as to contemplate asking her minor student for her baby when they are born. Becoming a mother also helps Ro's pseudo-attempt to generate a clean slate, because having a child, a boy specifically, in her mind triggers the metaphorical reset button and gives her the illusion of a redo in regard to her brother's untimely passing. This is why in Ro's imagined sequences, she only pictures a life with a son, never a daughter. The child was never really supposed to be her child, but a surrogate for her brother, a way to correct the mistakes of the past. Next, I will talk about the trauma Luce experienced in Gold Fame Citrus. The forced exploitation that Luce's father put her through, in conjunction with the untimely loss of her mother due to suicide by drowning, caused Luce to develop low self-esteem and an inability, to finish what she starts. According to Jill Eamon Amos in her article, Love Attitudes, Similarities Between Parents and Between Parents and Children, that children learn about attachment, love, and security from their early caregivers, typically their parents. It has been proposed that these earliest lessons are linked in some ways to adult abilities to forge successful relationships. Since Luce was used by her father and had lost the only real stability she ever had in the form of her mother, it's no wonder she struggles to feel secure as a mother, a girlfriend, or simply just as a person. Luce's experience as a poster child for the decay of California reflects Luce's own personal mental decay. As the conditions of the state grow worse, so does Luce's mental state. A modern example of what Luce went through is the similar story of Jeanette McCurdy. She was a child star who was abused at the hands of her mother, and she has been very outspoken and honest about her experiences with the trauma that resulted in navigating having PTSD. Luce, similarly, also has PTSD resulting from her trauma. Having to deal with this trauma coincided with the death of her mother is the primary cause of Luce developing post-traumatic stress disorder, also known as PTSD. PTSD is extremely common for victims of trauma to develop, especially children. The ramifications for developing PTSD at such a young age are terrible. Divya Mehta explains in her article, childhood maltreatment is associated with distinct genomic and epigenetic profiles in post-traumatic stress disorder, that maltreatment during childhood likely influences fundamental biological processes. This leads to adverse health outcomes as an adult. Luce shows signs of having PTSD throughout the novel. One example would be the fact that Luce has self-destructive behavior, like her consuming copious amounts of root, a drug with hallucinogenic properties, and never being able to overcome the indignity that her past has brought her. The PTSD that Luce has set the foundation for her eventual mental breakdown, and that mental instability made it impossible for Luce to continue on after losing Ig, her adoptive daughter, yet another traumatic event in her already very turbulent life. When Luce sees a body of water, maybe for the first time since her mother's passing, it reminded her of her mother's suicide, and she just couldn't take it anymore. All this combined with years of continuous trauma left Luce feeling like the only thing that she could do was take her own life. So that leaves a question. What could have possibly been done to help Luce and Ro? The only real way of helping Luce, Ro, or anyone going through emotional turmoil is to receive some form of therapy or counseling. It's strongly agreed upon by experts in the field of psychology and psychiatry that some form of counseling should be implemented in order to help mitigate the trauma suffered by the patient. Patients being treated for childhood trauma-related incidents can either go to individualized therapy or group therapy, depending on what professionals believe is the best course of action for the individual. This is typically done on a case-to-case basis because everyone internalizes their trauma differently, even if two people had similar experiences growing up. Yocha explains that care must be taken not to use any method or style that stimulates more stress than a member can tolerate. Although group and/or personalized therapy is almost always considered universally beneficial, it will be necessary for the patient and therapist to come to an agreement about what they can talk about, not talk about, and when it is okay for new information to be divulged. Both the patient and the psychologist or psychiatrist will have to wait a sufficient amount of time for the therapy to take proper effect. Otherwise, it may lead to the patient opening up a mental wound that they just simply aren't able to cope with being opened at that point in their healing journey. The main reason why both Luce and Ro suffer so greatly is due to the fact that, given their individual circumstances in the worlds they reside in, neither one of them is able to receive any treatment of any kind for their afflictions. When Luce was born, the world was already spiraling into disaster. Since the world was much more focused on climate change than anything else, mental health had to take a back seat, meaning Luce never even had the opportunity to seek counseling. Ro, on the other hand, may live in a more stable universe than Luce, but she is completely unaware that she needs help. She is a single woman with a teaching job who is spending more than she can truly afford on doctor visits in the attempt to become pregnant. She is so focused on the singular goal that she is living well beyond her means, missing work, and is unaware that she needs counseling in the first place. She is shunting the root cause for her wanting a child into the back of her mind. She is focused entirely on the obtaining of a child, ignoring the fact that it leaves her no time to ponder the possibility that she is making herself even more mentally unwell and is giving herself more stress than necessary by obsessing. This is especially so when the outcome is looking more and more bleak for her, that she may not be able to have any child at all. And that's all I have for you tonight. Thank you.
I'll invite both our first two panelists to the front.
So questions, comments for our first two panelists?
Good question. And it could be for either one of you. I'm just trying to, you're making me think all sorts of things. I really enjoyed your talks. Mary, you said something like, parents don't always realize it, and I won't get to quote perfect. Parents don't always realize that children are flawed human people. Yep. Is there, how do you introduce that concept in the real world to parents, not being overly coercive, but understanding that maybe there is some sort of intervention training? And I'm thinking about counseling too, Jessica. You know, how do you get people to understand all of this is really complex?
I mean, I think, I feel like someone brought this up in Monday's presentation, but I feel like in general, parents should have a lot more, like potential parents should have a lot more access to, you know, here's what you need to know. Like, I mean, there's baby books, but like, do you actually want to become a parent, or is this just something you feel like you're obligated to do? Here's what actually having a child will entail, like access to information about parenthood that isn't that very romanticized, snuggling the baby and watching them go off to college, whatever else. I think there should be access to information that's like, hey, this is a person, you're going to have to deal with that for at least 18 years and then the rest of their life. So I think very important that people have access to that kind of information.
I agree. Also, like when you mentioned baby books, it made me think that there really isn't books about like true childhood. Like there are books about like teenagers and like how to navigate having a teenager, but then there's that mid ground of like actual childhood, like elementary school, that I feel like is kind of overlooked because they're just kids. They don't, haven't really fully formed their personality yet, but that isn't true. I feel like there needs to be more knowledge about like that elementary, middle school, or like prior to middle school age. So like parents have a better idea of how their kids are functioning at this point. Because like psychology doesn't start at when the day you turn 13. It starts the moment you're born and it keeps on building upon itself with each new experience.
Building on what Professor Ginsella's question. So let's just say that a lot more parents were to realize that children, this is geared towards Mary, are flawed individuals. Do you think that they could in turn kind of gear towards the more this is for lack of a better word, the child demonization? And how would you combat against that? Or would you think that child demonization would be a part of child dehumanization or weaponization?
Okay. I like that question. I think it's all a matter of like the language that you use. Just like if you write a book and it's like, children are hell spawns, please don't have them. Like I wouldn't recommend, but just, I don't know, images of the lesser known aspects of anyway.
Interesting book though.
I'll publish it anyway. Like lesser known or less talked about aspects of childhood, like your kid is going to grow up and have a personality and it might not align with what you want it to be, and you have to deal with that because they are a person. So like I think there's a way to find a balance between like making out children to be little monsters and making them out to be just like people,
Well, can I ask a question?
Yeah.
I wasn't sure. Okay. I'm wondering, talking about like the, kind of our modern day, what do you think potentially is in this conversation the role of social media when it comes to this discussion of seeing children as perfection and ideal? What do you think like the role is, and how do you think that impacts kind of like modern day parenting?
Oh, I think it plays a big role. So I talk a bit about social media in my paper, not specifically to do with like the whole like the ideal, but social media is in general the place to portray yourself as like a perfect individual. So definitely, you go on social media, you see these perfect moms with their perfect babies, and everything is like, oh, we're snuggling together and we've got the Christmas picture and whatever. I think it definitely plays a big role, because if you're a potential parent and you're looking at these pictures online and everyone's just got their perfect babies or whatever, then it probably is going to influence the way you think about parenthood and like becoming a parent, so I think it definitely plays a big role.
This one's for both of you to answer. What do you think is the next step to take to lessen the abuse of children?
I don't think first. I'm just trying to think. I guess talking about it, I know that sounds very simple, but I feel like a lot of parents are afraid to share when their kids are being bratty, like, oh, they're being bratty because I'm a bad parent, I can't control them. But that's not necessarily true. Even the best parents out there are going to have kids who act out. If you have a child that doesn't act out, there's probably actually something wrong. That's what I always say. If someone seems a little too perfect, there's probably something going on beneath the surface. That parents needs to like come together and all come to terms that like they shouldn't be embarrassed when their kid has a tantrum in the store, because as embarrassing as it is, it's going to happen. It's a normal part of life. Everybody does it. It's like when people get annoyed at the baby crying on the airplane. You were the baby crying on the airplane at one point. So I think it's like, like kind of stepping out of yourself and like really looking and being like, this is natural, this is normal, and that's okay. I think like coming to terms as a society, I don't know how that would be done, but I think coming to terms as a society that kids are brats sometimes is what we need.
I don't know how I can do any better than that. But yeah, I mean, I think kind of what Jess is saying, but I think it goes back to having access to information and just knowing what you're getting into before you're getting into it, I would say.
For Jess, I was wondering how you think Maddie would kind of fit into your topic as an adult with her parents being so open about their being pro-life and then Rose's attachment to her. Do you think that cycle, not necessarily cycle of abuse, but their trauma going on to her will affect her in her adult life?
I do think it will affect her. Excuse me, how much is kind of unknown. I think even when parents don't mean to, any type of projection is bad. I think the real thing is, does Maddie acknowledge that this is a projection of her parents, or does she think this is a thought she herself came up with? Because I think that's the thing. Because like for me personally, my mom's a huge tomboy, I'm not. And as a child, I felt bad that I wasn't a tomboy. I was like, I must be doing something wrong because I don't want to wear the clothes my mom buys me. So like, I feel like Maddie might feel it that way, but I've acknowledged it, that it was a projection of my mom, not a character flaw on my part. So I do genuinely think it's whether Maddie realizes that this is a projection or not, if that makes sense.
Okay, I have a question for each of you. So Jess, so what was your inspiration for this project? I know it's really generic. Did you always know that you were gonna focus on this aspect? Did you kind of read the book and say, hey, this is very obvious? And does this topic have any special professional or personal meaning to you? But if the personal is too personal, obviously, like you don't have to answer that.
No, I'm okay with sharing it. I kind of wanted to put it in my actual thing, but I didn't know where to put it in where it flowed logically. I've had my own form of childhood trauma. My best friend died when I was 12 from cancer. So when I was reading the stories and looking for something to like follow through with, I noticed the connection between Luce and Roe. Like, I don't know if it was obvious to anyone else that they had, you know, similarities in that regard, but it kind of just jumped out to me. And like, that's basically the reason why I chose it. Cause like, I can relate, like I didn't even realize I needed therapy until I was 18, and Maddie died. Her name was Maddie as well. She died when I was 12. So, and I'm 24 now. And I didn't start going to therapy for it until I was 18 because I didn't know I didn't know I was depressed. I had no idea. My parents don't really believe in therapy, so I kind of had to wait until I could make my own decisions to do it. So that's basically the whole inspiration for this.
Thank you. Oh yes, and I have a book for Mary. So after having done all this research on child dehumanization, is there any one aspect of dehumanization that you think is the most harmful, or are they all equal in terribleness, but just in different ways?
See, my first is objectification, because that was kind of like the driving, like that was what kind of made, well, yeah, that's kind of what made me think of it anyway. But they're all kind of bad in equal ways, and they're bad in equal ways because they all kind of like loop into each other. So like you can't have the child as a weapon unless we haven't already established that children are like perfect beings who need to be protected. Because then you like, you know what I mean? Like you have to take away the agency before you can weaponize them. And same goes for like objectification, I suppose. Like if you believe that children are supposed to be like perfect inhuman beings, then if your kid is not that and is an imperfect human, then you're going to be like, what's up with this? And then that kind of like, it leads into objectification because you expect them to fulfill your ideal, you know what I mean? So that they all kind of bleed into each other in the worst way.
I want to allow Professor Long to jump in here. You want to unmute?
Yeah, thanks. I may have first want to just congratulate you guys. What's that?
No, we're not able to hear you.
Oh,
I'm not sure if it's an audio issue on our end. Now our volume's up.
how about now?
Oh, now try.
I am.
Oops. There we go. Okay. Now we can hear you.
You can hear me? Yeah. Okay. So first, I just wanted to congratulate you both for the presentations and also getting through to senior seminar. I wanted to ask if you coordinated your shirts.
it was an accident.
But also I was thinking about like how a lot of teens are very active with climate change and then also with anti gun laws, but particularly if they've been affected in their schools. And I was wondering if there were instances in the books where the teenagers actually use this kind of like their own youth as a kind of not a propaganda, but as a position of power to sort of combat ideas as much as they have been used in the books. Does that make any sense?
Are you asking if the teenagers themselves were doing this or their parents were doing it to them?
Yeah, that's why I was wondering if there was any instances where they kind of are self-empowered.
Is Bird a teenager? Because I don't know. Are there?
Or maybe not the kids. The kids.
Maddie's a teenager.
Maddie is a teenager, but I don't really think because
I mean, you know what? So this isn't really a social justice thing, but she is trying to get an abortion throughout the novel, and she gets shut down multiple times, and she keeps trying. And I talk about this in my essay actually, but she refuses to not get an abortion. So like in that way, I mean, she does enforce that she has agency. It's not really like a social justice thing because it's only like on an individual level, but she does do that.
yeah, like Bird is the only.
Yeah, I just didn't know if the children seemed to be self-empowered in the novels, even though the society is trying to make them not be that way.
Yeah, some of them are so young.
Yeah.
And like there's that age factor, but maybe in our missing hearts.
Right, Bird, I mean, it's not really a social justice thing again, but he sees.
No, I didn't mean it. Yeah, necessarily, but yeah.
Yeah.
It like ends up helping the cause,
Right.
but it wasn't their original intention.
Yeah.
I would say Sadie too.
Oh, I
Right,
forgot about Sadie. Yeah, definitely Sadie. Sadie is fighting for the rights for sure.
Like Daddy and the whales.
Oh, I forgot about the whales too.
Other questions, comments?
Yeah, I was going to say, my question for Jess was very similar to Lauren's point. But I guess, Mary, I know this has kind of been like a through line for you throughout the semester, and you've always just really picked up on it. But so how much did you go into this research with your own interpretations of the novels, or did the research really kind of enlighten more than you had expected and kind of developed all these other different layers of what you were talking about?
I mean, it definitely helped. I remember I was reading the political one that I mentioned by Mulder, the article. And I was like, oh my God, like, so it kind of, the more I researched, the more I felt like I needed to talk about it because I was like, oh, there was so many instances of like children being dehumanized and that sucks. So like the more I researched, the more I felt the need to keep going, I think, so, yeah.
Would you say that dehumanization assists fetal personhood, or does it work against it?
Okay, I have an interesting thought for that. I was thinking about it in the shower last night, because anyone was wondering. But so I think the whole fetal personhood thing is actually it's a very ironic stance to have, because so the fetal personhood, it really, the whole anti-choice rhetoric goes back to very like idealizing imagery, you know, because and I talk about this in my paper, but they don't really use the image of the fetus. It's like a baby. It's all like, look how cute this kid is, and you could have one of your very own, and it deserves to be loved and whatever. But they're really not treating it as a person, and especially in the anti-choice movement, like the second that baby is out, it really is no longer. It can't be used anymore, like to fulfill an agenda. So they can't. They don't care. Like if the baby is marginalized in some way, especially, I heard someone talking about this a while ago, but you know, like it's no longer, I had a great word and I forget it. Anyway, but they no longer care about the baby once it's like a physical baby and not like in. So it really is kind of an ironic statement that they're advocating for fetal personhood, because once it is a person, they no longer care about it. I was so eloquent in my fictional response in my head last night, but this is what we got.
That's great, thank you. And at the end of your presentation, you spoke about how in an ideal world, right, there'd be therapy. Do these novels suggest any therapeutic tools that maybe are outside of, or, you know, given the extreme circumstances, so if it's not traditional therapy, are there other things that we might see as, I guess, sort of positive coping mechanisms for their childhood trauma?
I would say more so in Red Clocks than Gold Fame Citrus. Gold Fame Citrus is kind of a downer, like there's really no hope there. But with Red Clocks, it does have a lot more of an open ending with Ro. Like with Ro, there is some hope that she might be able to overcome this and make it to the other side, so to speak, because when she's talking with, I believe it's her older friend, like just, you know, she was separating herself from her friend, probably, you know, like not really on purpose. I don't think it's because she didn't want to talk to her, but it was because of that focus that she wasn't focusing on her friendships or anything else, like the other important things in her life, the people she already has. And I think that just having that conversation with her was the first step to her getting better. Just acknowledging, you know, she does have at least one person who truly cares about her. And even if she doesn't have a child, she has options. She's gonna hurt for a while. She's gonna be upset. I do think therapy probably would be the best thing because, you know, it's all about her brother. But I do think it's the first step in her making it to the other side, is just like opening her mind to what else she can do, what else she can put her focus into.
I want to, I think we'll ask, but I'll, as you chat, I'm gonna ask that the next presenters, or if anyone wants to get some additional snacks or needs a quick bathroom break, that we do that, just to make sure that the next, everyone has enough time to ask for a question.
Jess, I have a question. So do you think that in Ro objectifying, or really for both of you, do you think that Ro in objectifying this ideal baby, this hypothetical baby, do you think that she's also at the same time objectifying herself as a person, saying she is nothing outside of motherhood?
I would agree, like, very strongly on that.
Yeah.
I feel bad for her. Like, I would just want to like grab her by the shoulders and be like, there's so much more to you. She puts herself down constantly throughout the novel for no reason other than she can't get pregnant. And it's really sad to hear like the state of it. It's really sad. But I do think she objectifies herself because of that. I definitely agree.
Yeah, I don't know. That was a really good response.
I'm sorry, I was thinking about that while we were reading the book. Like whenever I got to her chapters, I'm like, oh, I'm about to yell at her again. To be like, come on, you're better than this. I know you are.
I just feel like it's because of the pressure, like there's so many guys that pressure on her, that she can't even know herself or get into her identity because of it.
Mhm.
Thank you for question. And you can have your conference swag. Surprise conference swag. Your mystery. Thank you for coming. Thank you for being there. Good to see you. Very cool. Thank you. Does anyone need a little break? You're doing okay? Snacks, drinks? No one's thinking that what is it, like deep breath tea or? Maybe after.
Yeah.
We'll give folks just a minute and then.
Of course.
And you can, obviously, you know, you can make it small so it doesn't.
Okay,
And I can help you if you need any technician.
thank you.
I did with the science.
Yeah. We'll give folks just a minute.
Very excited.
Yes.
Huh? Thank you. I was so worried. Well, okay, I guess it's not, oh, let me preemptively
Yeah, you
share
can,
the screen.
share it. And then-
Oh, right
right
here,
here. Yep.
okay.
I'm so excited you're using Prezi. I thought I was like the only person who.
I was like, I was like, is this too much? And I was like, there is no too much. Originally, I was trying to make, because this was an existing template with all the books here.
Yeah.
And I was trying to, this is so embarrassing. So I was trying to make all these books that we've read in this class. So originally I had like Our Missing Hearts and Severance here, but I couldn't figure out how to rotate the text. So it looked really dumb. And like it was going off the page. And I was like, oh, okay. Yeah, I know. I was like, should I add animation? Should we do a barrel roll into as a form of segue? Oh, and I would just like to tell everybody straight up, I believe in edutainment. So this is a fun presentation. I don't like to be too serious. So okay. Yeah, no.
Where's the barrel roll?
Yeah, well, right.
We'll just give Jess and Emily a chance to come back and then we'll get started again. So great time, more snacks. Yeah.
While I was working on this presentation, I was listening in the background to a retelling of Aladdin. It was Jafar and Jasmine, and I was terrified it would make it somewhere up in here that I would be like, and then Jafar said, so I had to keep checking it to make sure. Oh, I got like halfway through before I was like, okay, we gotta stop.
Your ability for like multi-processing astounds me.
There's this one video essay, and I use it for good luck on all of my big projects like this towards the end of the year. And unless I listen to it, it's like this woefully outdated top 25 Disneyland attractions. It's 2 hours long. The audio quality is horrible. I love it. And unless I listen to it, this could not be possible without. Yeah.
I personally like to listen to like Mario Kart music or
Oh,
jazz.
well, okay.
To concentrate.
Jazz, classical, like Debussy.
Yes, yes.
Is there more than one song to Mario Kart? Everything that like plays over and over again on the video game or like.
Sometimes it's like you can put it to like 1 hour, some has 5 hours, some are 20 hours long, where it just like all the songs just playing with you.
Okay.
But it encourages productivity. And so while it's going the do, I'm just like typing. Yeah.
I've done that. I've been doing instrumental pop songs. I feel like I'm singing along a little bit, but if I don't sing, I'm just still like, I know it.
I'll do like my funk playlist because there's a lot of guitar, my fish. So there's like 10-minute guitar breaks in the middle, so I can't sing along anyway if I wanted to.
Sometimes when like if it's a particular kind of project, I listen to that kind of, like this is the soundtrack for this paper or whatever. And then a different paper, I have a different sort of playlist or soundtrack. No, I haven't, no.
Interesting, Kristen, hear that music.
Yeah.
Thrown back at the project.
Yeah. Like there's music I would listen to a lot when I was writing my dissertation and it immediately, like takes me back there.
I'm actually that way with candles, like at least
Oh.
write a paper with one candle burning.
Yeah.
Like last semester I had spice, cinnamon, vanilla for my Dr. Cosby paper. Now it's
Like all of that
Yeah.
is that
this one's
connection.
perfect.
Thanks again for everyone who's joining us virtually or watching this recording. And thanks to everyone who's here in the room with us. Our last panel of the evening and the semester is Stranger Than Fiction, Speculative Genres and Archives.
Alrighty. Let's just hit that good old present button. Alrighty. Speculative Fiction Junction. What's your function? Ling, Severance, Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, and Leni Zumas's Red Clocks. Hello, everybody, and thank you all for coming. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Lauren, and I'm here to tell you guys a little bit about feminist speculative fiction's function. It rolls right off the tongue. Let's get started. So first we need to set some parameters, right? And we need to talk about intentional versus perceived function. But don't worry, it's super easy. So the intended function is the author's canonical intent, and this can only be confirmed by the author. It can be speculated, but at the end of the day, unless the author says it, we cannot say for certain. The perceived function, meanwhile, is just what it sounds like. It's the audience's interpretation of the work. There is not necessarily one correct one. It's just whatever the audience can interpret. And of course, when I say function, I'm referring to just the overall goal of the work. So, I know you guys are on the edge of your seats waiting to hear all about the function of feminist speculative fiction. But before we do that, we need to take a step back and we need to talk about the origins of the genre. Now, I bet when you guys hear speculative fiction, you guys think of things like The Hunger Games, The Walking Dead, 1984. Is what I would say if I knew you guys weren't already consumed with 12 weeks of Severance, Red Clocks, and Future Home of the Living God. Maybe Professor Kinsella. That's what you think about. But despite all beliefs, this is not a new genre. Speculative fiction began in 1516 when Sir Thomas More published Utopia. In Utopia, he imagined a perfect society in which there is no poverty, an emphasis on education, no thievery, no... such a big word, less corruption in the government, all of that good stuff that we've definitely fixed in the past 500 years since he published it. This was written to critique his society and is widely considered the first piece of speculative fiction, and that is Drew Barrymore reciting Utopia. But that doesn't answer the question as to what the function of the genre is. However, Darko Subin answered that in his book Metamorphoses of Science Fiction. He believed that the function of speculative fiction is to transport the audience to a world that is fundamentally different from their own. Once the audience is transported, the audience can then receive the author's message, if there even is a message, safely. The degree of separation is crucial, and that is the true function of the genre, at least according to Subin. Additionally, Subin does state that speculative fiction serves a purpose to not only the audience, but the author as well, and that is to provide an outlet in which the author can explore creatively, not hampered by the limitations of our current reality. Okay, so we've talked enough about the history of speculative fiction, so obviously now we're going to get to the function, right? Wrong again. So because we need to talk about the definition of feminist speculative fiction. So in the article, Naomi Alderman's The Power, a feminist speculative fiction mirroring the here and now by Tuhin Shuvra Sen posits that the definition of feminist speculative fiction is when authors envisage a world, a space and time in which women are not restricted to the stereotyped gender and identities enforced on them by the authoritarian patriarchal values that pervade their present reality. By Sen's definition, feminist speculative fiction's function is to consider, maybe not illustrate, but at least imagine a reality in which women and men are more equal than they are currently. Did I skip past that? No, I didn't. Alrighty, so that brings us to the question, what is the function of feminist speculative fiction? Well, we're going to use this same article, Naomi Alderman's The Power, a feminist speculative fiction, a speculative feminist dystopian fiction mirroring the here and now, by Tuhin Shuvra Sen. So she posits that the genre sets out to expose the existing gender inequality, break down the gender binary, and thus open up new vistas of potentiality for women to work towards their own empowerment and contribute to the development of the human race. If the general goal and function of speculative fiction is to transport the audience so that they can safely receive a message, then the function of feminist speculative fiction is about using said fictitious world to bring awareness to, confront, and defy existing gender roles in the world that the readers inhabit. This implies that the function of the subgenre is to encourage and empower the audience to rise up against the evils of gender inequality so that the possibilities presented in the novel can be realized. And now we can finally get into talking about the book. Alrighty, so Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich is the tale of an indigenous woman named Cedar Songmaker who finds herself pregnant in the apocalypse. Because the world is apparently devolving, the government rounds up women and forces them to get pregnant and give birth. The novel ends with Cedar, who is recently giving birth, readying to begin the cycle anew, submitting to the tyrannical powers that be. It's a real uplifting message. Anyway, so the intended function, right? So luckily we do not have to guess towards the intended function of the novel because Erdrich has directly stated it herself. In a 2017 interview between Erdrich and Margaret Atwood, author of The Handmaid's Tale, she reveals that the inspiration behind Future Home began when George W. Bush was elected in 2000. She said, quote, "I saw the results of electing George W. Bush as a disaster for reproductive rights. Sure enough, he began by reinstating the global gag rule, which cuts international funding for contraceptives if abortion is mentioned. Also crucial for me was climate change. That, coupled with the quote posted here, is extremely telling as to what the function of the novel is. The function of the novel, or the intended function that is to urge readers into awareness, action, and stress the importance of information concerning reproductive and environmental justice. But that is not the only function of the novel, because now we have my version. So the author's intended function is not the only interpretation of the work. There are multiple quotes on this board and plenty more within the novel of a similar vein. They illustrate Cedar's insistence on keeping the child despite what everybody is telling her. She knows that if she carries this child to term, she is risking injury, imprisonment, and even death for both her and her family. Despite this, Cedar chooses to carry the fetus to term. Therefore, I argue that the function of the novel is to represent an underrepresented side to the pro-choice argument, and that is when a woman's choice is to keep the fetus. Much of the conversation around the pro-choice argument involves abortive care, and for good reason, it is what's under attack. However, the function of Future Home of the Living God by Louise Erdrich is to show that being pro-choice and having a child are not mutually exclusive. But other scholars have interpreted it differently. Take, for example, Silvia Martinez Falquina's Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God, Uncertainty, Prophetic Mourning, and Relationality in Native Dystopia. In this, the author asserts that the function of the novel, or a function of the novel, lies within the contentious aspect of the world building. Throughout the novel, Cedar finds it difficult to operate in this new world because she knows virtually nothing about what's going on, and ostensibly neither does the audience. The author asserts that the ever-present aura of confusion was created purposefully to reflect the vulnerability of Indigenous Americans, and really all women in current American society. While claiming Future Home is an analogous representation of the present, Martinez Falquina also states that the novel's emphasis on the future, quote, turns the novel into a literary ritual of prophetic mourning aimed at making us react before ecological disaster becomes inevitable, end quote. In the mind of Silvia Martinez Falquina, the function of Future Home of the Living God is to not only reflect present times, but also to give a warning to its audience about the worst yet to come. And now we're going to talk about Red Clocks by Leni Zumas. So it is the tale of 4 women in a sleepy Oregon town. There's Ro, a teacher who desperately wants a child, Susan, a mother of 2 young children, Jin, the quote-unquote town witch, and Maddie, a young teenager who finds herself pregnant in an America where abortion is illegal. Much like with Future Home, audiences don't have to guess as to what the function of Red Clocks is. In a 2018 interview, Zumas revealed that, quote, the threats to reproductive rights in Red Clocks are based directly on laws that have been suggested and promoted by current members of the Trump administration, end quote. This, coupled with the quote that is posted up here, is very telling as to the function of the novel. The function of the novel, by Zumas's own admission, is to urge readers to pay attention to what is happening in American politics, lest their rights be stripped from them right before their eyes. Good thing we avoided that, everybody. Of course, there's always my way of interpretation. I had to do a Disney quote. I'm wearing my name tag and everything. Alrighty, so the novel is clearly aimed at people who already have some working knowledge of reproductive rights. This novel is not written in a manner that would convince anybody to the other side. However, what I think it does is it definitely highlights the hypocrisy within the pro-choice movement. For example, most of the characters illustrate hypocrisy in some fashion. Roe is outspoken about reproductive justice in this new America, but when she is denied a baby, she tries to get Maddie, her underage student, to give birth so she can take the child from her. Jin, the town witch, helps plenty of women abort unwanted fetuses, but when it is her own grandchild who is getting aborted, she lies to Maddie and denies her an abortion. And Maddie turns her friend in for her friend's own safety after getting an abortion, but when it's Maddie's turn, she does not allow that same thing to happen to her. The function of the novel is to illustrate that the reproductive justice movement cannot progress due to the hypocrisy it is mired in. It is only with the dissolution of this hypocrisy that we as a society can progress forward. But that is not the only perceived function, of course. So we're going to return back to our friend Sylvia Martinez Felquina, but this time we're going to look at her article, Feminist Dystopia in Reality, in Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God and Leni Zumas's Red Clocks. In the article, that same name that I just read off, she points out that feminist speculative fiction took a turn after the 2016 presidential election. She concludes that modern feminist dystopias, such as Red Clocks, quote, can be considered a response to pressing socio-political developments of our time, unquote. She states that unlike traditional dystopian fiction, which serves as a warning to their audience, feminist speculative fiction, like Red Clock, functions as a contribution to the discussion around reproductive rights. So its main function is just to say what everybody else is saying and maybe add a new twist. According to her, that is. Alrighty, and lastly, we are going to talk about Severance by Ling Ma. It is the tale of a world torn apart by a pandemic that supposedly started in China. And before anyone asks, yes, it was published in 2018, and yes, I too am dying to know what that phone call looked like. Anyway, the fictional virus turns the victims, called the fevered, into living zombies. However, instead of the violent flesh eaters of fiction, these mindless drones are stuck obsessively repeating menial tasks. The protagonist, Candice Chen, is seemingly immune to the virus and finds a group of survivors who share that trait, though her pregnancy becomes a mounting concern. Similar to our other two authors we've already discussed, Ling Ma has made clear what her function of the novel was. She had started this novel after she was laid off at her own job, and it was her boss's insidious cutting down of staff that inspired this passion piece. So she was writing in anger, and she wanted to address, quote, something about globalism and the workplace, unquote. By her own admission, the novel functions as a critique of economic globalization, as well as a general critique of capitalism. There we go. However, this isn't the only meaning that can be gleaned from the text. The text serves as a critique of capitalism, this much is true. However, the novel also serves as a warning against the audience about consumerism. When we think of capitalism, we might think of Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk and these big men in suits that we will never hope to be as rich as, but we are just as complacent because we participate in consumerism. In the novel, two survivors who are believably, apparently immune to the virus, Bob and Ashley are their names, succumb to the fever eventually. For Ashley, this is triggered when she tries on her old clothing in her childhood home, and Bob when the group reaches a mall. As you can see from the quotes posted above, both of these are discussed using a language of excess. Consumerism, whether it is the precious gemstones, expensive clothes, or even just the act of window shopping in the apocalypse, makes the function clear. Ling Ma's Severance functions as a warning to the audience against their own consumerism and materialism. Alrighty, but we have other scholars who have said different things. So the novel's prediction of the coronavirus, while unintentional, brings into question what happens when a warning comes too late. Ling Ma's Severance, a dystopian pre/post-apocalyptic novel in the time of COVID-19 by Soha A. Helmy, analyzes Severance to determine what the function of the novel is. She takes note of the similarities between the novel and real life, such as the supply shortages, the dependency on the government, and the emphasis on working through what feels like the end of the world, and ultimately concludes that the function of the novel is to critique late-stage capitalism. Okay, guys, you just sat through this big long presentation about the function of feminist speculative fiction, but like, why? I like, besides the fact that you guys had to be here, yeah, why did you sit through it, Professor Kinsella, is really what this is asking. Well, here's the answer. It is important. Yes. So even if a future exists where these novels are no longer relevant politically, a future which I particularly think is very far off, considering utopia is still very relevant in our current society, even 500 years later, they are still relevant as cultural pieces. They are not just important to the audiences in the present, but to audiences in the future. For them, they are a look into the cultural and political anxieties of our time. They are a look into what authors and audiences cared about, what their primary concerns were, and what their life was like at the time. These resources will be invaluable into the foreseeable future and beyond, as an entertaining story, a call to action, a conveying of information, and perhaps eventually a glimpse into the past. French for the end. Alrighty, here's my works cited, and of course, thank you all for coming to this presentation. Of course, none of this would be possible without my co-author, Mickey. I promised he would make an appearance, and here he is, Mickey Handsome Crowley and Lauren Elizabeth Crowley, working on this PowerPoint 2023 colorized.
Unless if you need any help giving a switching.
Let's see what I can do. Still
You might
share.
need to stop
Stop
share
share.
and then restart the share.
Okay. But okay. So as the last to present, I just want to say that I've loved being in this course with all of you. You've offered really, really insightful and amazing presentations. So that being said, I am Alexa, and I'm here to talk about Gold Fame Citrus by Claire V. Watkins. Now, most scholars who have written about Gold Fame Citrus do so regarding its human characters. We've learned about them, we've talked about them, Luz, Ig, Ray, Leni. While these characters present rich opportunities to explore gender, relationships, and society, I have chosen to explore and focus on what is missing from this novel's discourse, which is arguably the largest presence in the novel, and I mean that literally. The Dune Sea. I see the Dune Sea as a notable character, worthy of more attention, because of what it brings to readers' attention, not only in the story, but what the story reveals about our actual environment and society. And so today I present you with The Dune Sea of Gold Fame Citrus, Amargosa as Speculative Archive. I focus nearly exclusively on this amalgamation of abiotic earth medium because it is animated and personified, it's named, and because of this, a lot of scholars have included it in their writing to some degree. But before I get to my reading, I'm going to start with the novel and scholars, how they've described the Dune Sea. So the novel has said things like the dune is the world's most invasive species and yet no species at all. It's a scientific anomaly, a process that ought to have taken 500,000 years had happened in 50. The only known landmass of its kind, what geologists have called a pseudo-spontaneous phenomenon, a super dune, a symbol of the drought that has wrecked the American West. The Amargosa was a disease, a hungry beast, a self-spawning corpulence, a bloated blob gobbling land. The Amargosa was angry, cruel, or uncaring, personification, inevitable, and forgivable too, for at times the mass did seem to move with discernment. Moving on to scholars, our very own Dr. Jacobson has said that it is a tangible location and it is a mysteriously undefined, terrifyingly dangerous place. Erin Stalcup has said that the sand dune, a sand sea, a moving sand glacier has swallowed cities and is growing. It is simultaneously a consuming force and a transfixing mystery. Alex Hunt has said that it is a vast and growing dune sea named the Amargosa, envisioning geological processes in a human timescale, rises east of the Sierra Nevada and is moving eastward, again, swallowing cities and all landforms. It inspires wonder, spiritual fervor, endless metaphor, and personification. An agential super dune, sublime, the Southwest's new defining feature, a massive mobile super dune that swallows mountain ranges and cities. So not only does this characterization from the novel and scholars make the Dune Sea really significant, I think that it leads to a new reading of the Amargosa and the novel, that it can be interpreted as a speculative archive. But what does this term actually mean? You cannot Google it. The two words together in a phrase searched for scholarly articles is seldom giving a response or, results, but those results have nothing to do with what I am trying to get at. So essentially, a speculative archive is an interpretive concept built upon archival studies and the speculative fiction genre. I will talk through how I've ideated this term and then turn again to the Amargosa. So beginning with archives, I'll keep this really brief. We're going dictionary.com. They're repositories, places where records are kept. These records, usually historical documents, relate to the activities of a person, a family, corporation, association, community, or nation. Yet, scholars have come up with new conceptions of the archive, its function, its form, its purpose. The Lesbian Her Story Archive in New York City is actually an archive of material items belonging to lesbians and others in the queer community. Items such as pins, t-shirts, zines. And then even further, we have archives that are still physical, but a little bit more alternative or abstract in their concept, such as the body, which contains DNA and our personal narratives. A really good introduction to this body archive concept is from Kaylee Moots. She's written The Body and the Archive in Louise Erdrich's Future Home of the Living God. So, I personally believe I've expanded the archive even further into an alternative territory by abstracting record-keeping modalities and repository form. But here's where this exciting speculative genre comes in. A supergenre that encompasses other broad genres like fantasy and science fiction, really fun little acronyms, SF or SF, uppercase, lowercase, utopian, and dystopian. Speculative fiction is expected to be non-mimetic, which is not an imitation of the real world. Other genres that fall under this umbrella are climate fiction, my personal favorite, cli-fi, eco-dystopian, post-apocalyptic, and eco-fabulous. Now, eco-fabulist was a brand new term for me when I learned about this novel and started diving into research. Erin Stalcup's book review of the novel introduces that the Association of Writers and Writing Programs had a conference panel in 2014, and they kind of began describing this new emergence of a genre. And so Stalcup says that eco-fabulist as art is art that does not seek verisimilitude, but rather revels in impossibility to show us more clearly what is possible, specifically in regards to ecological catastrophe. So, why speculative fiction? Why does speculative fiction connect so well to archives? Although I've mentioned the non-mimetic nature of speculative fiction, in many ways, the genres under this umbrella do fall on a spectrum of mimesis. Depending on their content, they often do reflect our reality. My research pulls from scholars who use various speculative genre labels that focus on temporality, which is having to do with time, and/or they focus on climate change. So, starting with temporality, here, Gillian Spiess offers an understanding of science fiction. One common assumption about science fiction is that it's about the future, when in fact, science fiction is about the present, regardless of setting. Stories and genre reflect the concerns of the era in which they were written. For content, in the past few decades, we've seen an influx of discussions about how anthropogenic climate change has shaped this era. So a little bit more about anthropogenic climate change. It's an abstract concept to most Americans, especially in this time of climate denial. Yet novels like Gold Fame Citrus provide a special kind of insight for readers that visualizes this environmental shift. The novel imparts this awareness through the super Dune, but also through dialogue between characters. Leni is one of the more insightful people about the climate change and the Dune Sea, and he says to Luz, of course, this is a natural process we're talking about. This is the inevitable result of our own savagery, and we want to stop it because it reminds us of our tremendous neglect of and the violence we've done to this place. To which Luz responds to Ray, telling him about what she's learned from Leni. You know that sense we always had that we were missing something, that there was something fundamentally wrong in the way we approached the natural world? So hopefully I've given a good setup of this term and a good little overview of the novel, but let's get a little bit more into the interpretation of the Amargosa further. Oh, first of all, my premise, I forgot about this slide. The premise of my interpretation of this speculative archive is that it's based on American Cli-Fi's ability to show projections of climate change that are inherently related to our current reality. These texts archive America, its past and present, and even a future, because their narratives record the alternate future history created between now and a speculative outcome. So my argument for the Amargosa is that the Amargosa is not only a physical embodiment of undeniable anthropogenic climate change, but its very existence is also an archive of this process, natural resource mismanagement, and infrastructural ruin, making it an archive and an archivist that simultaneously curates and stores what it has subsumed, the interred landscape and life of an alternate American reality. So, part of this speculative archive is the recorded future history of infrastructure's life cycle in the Southwest, beginning in California. The novel's speculation fast forwards the functional and structural longevity of overextended aqueducts. There's a really brilliant passage early in the novel that plays with the eco-fabulous genre really well, and I think it provides a swift recap of the ruinous aqueduct failure with the subsequent extreme drought, which is, in my mind, and I think the novel makes the case that all of this is the cause for the formation of the super dune. So Ray, swept up in the thrashing oblivion of the Pacific, surfs through all the crises and shortages and conflicts, past and present. He was surfing through all the major infrastructure events that had happened, going back to when the Colorado River was dammed until its death 100 years later. He was surfing through the Los Angeles Aqueduct's continual failure, repair, and extension across the country. He was surfing as states sued states and as the courts shut down the ducts, and until the aquifers were no longer available to drain. At the end of this journey of Ray surfing through the Southwest's infrastructural downfall, we are introduced to the super dune that has entombed Las Vegas, which I think inherently connects the super dune to this archive of infrastructural ruin history. So, with this understanding of the history recorded in this speculative archive, let's move to the Amargosa as a curator. While I started thinking about speculative archives last spring, the repeated descriptions of this Dune Sea's curation really supports its interpretation as not only an archive, but a curator. The Dune curates, it knows who wants to be here. The Amargosa curates. The Amargosa had other plans for us, it curates. Luz remembered what the others had said about the Dune curating. So, while this just, so now we will turn back to a scholar because he has essentially fully summarized what I had in my mind, thought this whole time. So while he uses it for a different argument, I think it says precisely what was in my head. The Amargosa's curation is, or the Amargosa itself is composed of the fossilized remains, mineral deposits, and human remnants of previous epochs, now unearthed and amalgamated along with the geological features of the present, mountains, hills, and deserts, scraped from the surface of the earth. It also contains the pulverized structures of American modernity, roads, mines, towns, military bases, solar farms, and agriculturally cultivated landscapes that once contoured the topography of the Southwest, but which have been scoured, and digested by the Dune Sea. This summary really substantiates what I believe the Amargosa holds within its archive, what it has swallowed, subsumed, collected, what it has curated for itself as an archive. So, if we use the Amargosa as an example, I believe we can consider how contemporary American sci-fi speaks to the past, present, and speculative future. And if we see archives beyond conventional forms and functions, speculative archives can reveal realities we may not yet recognize. Furthermore, they help us anticipate the future of anthropogenic climate change through an alternate future history based on where we are now and how we got here. Ultimately, the insight from a speculative archive can inform our actions in the present to prevent future dystopia.
Thank you. I'll invite both of our panelists to the front so we can ask them questions.
Sorry. Go ahead. Entering from an awkward angle anyway.
Questions?
Yes.
Yeah, I have one question. Lauren and Alexa. Yeah. With Alexa, your presentation honestly was very insightful in just considering how speculative fiction can be kind of incorporated into archives. How would you go about trying to kind of argue like the literary discussion behind it, especially when people kind of consider literature to be like, I guess like a pastime when it comes to just the conversations around it. how would you get people in the archival field to kind of see the importance of it when talking about archives?
So people in the archival field.
Yes.
There are, discussions among scholars about how bodies of literature are archives. As far as literary texts as archives in and of themselves, I haven't come across too much of it. There are some, and I've utilized them in previous papers when trying to build this up. But I really think I've done a lot of research on the postmodern shift in archival studies, which really has allowed for an abstraction to happen of how we believe archives are formed, how they function, who curates them, power, all of that. So I think we're kind of in a moving direction towards that. I think it would take a lot more literary scholars to keep putting this out there, which they are taught. Like, speculative fiction is so popular in discourse, and this relationship between the past, the present, and the future, I think just connects so well with archives that, I've even spoken to Heather Perez, and she thinks it's interesting. So I imagine professional archivists can be open to this as long as it was just described appropriately, and whether or not I'm the person to do that, I don't know. But so yeah, I think that there's promise for acceptance of literary text to be speculative archives, or at least as an interpretation.
And then for Lauren, I just want to know, I felt like your last point, I think you were making about severance. It was consumerism and capitalism. How did you come to kind of think to incorporate that within your argument? Because I would have never gotten that interpretation from that text.
Honestly, and maybe this isn't the best or the correct answer, but I was kind of I saw that, and no disrespect to the scholars who have already talked about it, but a lot of scholars were just repeating that it is a critique of capitalism. And I think that a lot of scholars and people in general, when they think of critique of capitalism, it's this faceless, nameless, and if it is names and it is faces, it's faces we've seen so often and names we've heard so often that they've essentially lost all meaning. Like, Jeff Bezos is not a person, he's an idea, But the idea that we, for all of our, and I can't speak for everything, of course, but for, everybody's critiques of late stage capitalism, we all take part in it, to different degrees, but we all still participate in it in some fashion. And when I was looking at the text, I was going over it, I really just wanted, you can't step away from the fact that this is a novel about capitalism, but I really just wanted to reframe it and be like, how can I think of this in a way that has not been thought about before? Or I don't even want to give myself that credit, I'm sure it's been thought about before, but in a way that hasn't been brought up as much in scholarly discussion. I hope that answers your question.
I have a question for Lauren. I know you talked about, for the majority of your presentation, the intended function and the perceived function. I just want to know more like what your thought process behind that, your research and how, kind of differentiate the intended function and what is kind of perceived when, reading through it and stuff.
Well, I think
If that makes sense. I'm trying to-
no, yeah, totally. I'm sorry. I was like the wheels are turning. Okay. I think that I just author, what? I thought of it when I was reading this interview with Margaret Atwood and Louise Erdrich. Yeah. And they talk, they're talking about both of their novels, they're discussing it, and Atwood said something like Cedar's adoptive parents fetishize her indigenousness. And Erdrich is like, wait a second, that's not what I wrote. and they didn't like have an altercation, it didn't, end in fistfights. But just there's this disconnect between the author might not have said to herself or themselves, I'm going to write it this way, but it still might be present in the text for the readers to pick up on, and that's based on lived experiences and any of that stuff. And just the fact that I think it's beautiful that there's 1,000 different ways that you can like interpret a text, and it could be totally different from what the author wanted. And I'm in love with the concept, especially in the year 2023 when let's just say people are problematic, but I am in love with the concept of death of the author, and does authorial intent matter? I think it's really fascinating. I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, absolutely.
I have a question for both of you. Alexa, what encouraged you to write about the Amargosa and the Dune Sea as like characters in a way?
I think it just is such a presence, like it's in the background, but it moves in the foreground. It forces the characters to move themselves. And there's just so much imagery and descriptions of what lies beneath. Every scholar has this huge chunk of what lies beneath, the mines, all of that, the material, the structures. It's caused infrastructural damage. There's highways that have collapsed and people have died and schools have been subsumed. So there really was just, and not to mention the word curate was multiple times included in there. But I had already had this speculative archive in my mind. So I guess I wasn't necessarily reading for it, but the opportunity really presented itself because it is such a anthropogenic climate change motivated novel. And I think that that's pretty unanimous among scholars. So I just saw it as like a real presence and an entity. It had a name, like it swallowed like all of this imagery and characterization just really made it feel so much more significant than a lot of the characters necessarily directly talked about.
Some of that. Lauren, my question was more for like your opinion. Do you think that the author's interpretation, I forget what you called it.
Like the intended function.
Yeah. Do you think the author's intended function is more important than perceived intention? Or do you think they're about equal?
I think that's a hard question. That's so like fake of me to say, I'm sorry. That's a hard question, it really is. Next one. But I think that it's a case by case basis. I really hesitate to say that anything is more important or any one interpretation is correct over the other. Because I think the author, without knowing it, has biases that they put into their work. So even if it's not their intention to write something, what the reader gets away from it, what the audience gets away from it, is extremely important. And at the end of the day, I think there's an argument to be made of, well, who cares if it's not what the author intended? If it's what people are reading, well, that your audience is, especially for authors, your audience is the most important thing, one could argue. I think this also changes, like I said, based on the context. If the author is writing intentionally harmful things, I think that does take precedence over everything else. So I think, it's a case by case basis, in my opinion. And I know that's a cop out answer, but I'm so sorry. I hope that answered your question.
So my original question was very similar to Emily's, but I do have like a secondary question for Alexa. Are there any other notable novels that you thought of while making this presentation that have a character like the Dune Sea, a personified object that takes on a life of its own, or is more than the sum of its parts, that helped to inspire the idea to write about the Amargosa?
Yeah, good question. So honestly, I'm structuring, kind of thinking out an outline for my thesis that I'll begin writing next semester. So last spring, I, interpreted a whole textual entity as a speculative archive. So with all of that in mind, kind of what I was going for when this type of imagery and characterization came up for the Dune Sea, it fit, it just went in that way. But no, I haven't really considered any other novels with that type of entity. The next part of my thesis will be a series of novels by Octavia Butler, the Parable series. So I'm kind of doing a textual entity, a character entity, and then like a series entity of journals, diary entries. So that's interesting. I should keep my eye out for that.
So awkward now, 'cause it's kind of pretty the same question, but it was just how did your previous knowledge and interest in eco-criticism help you develop this concept?
Yes, there was going to be a lot more eco-criticism in this. I, learned so much last spring about Rob Nixon's slow violence and what was the other thing I was going to go for? Can't remember right now. But I was thinking all of these eco-critical terms and they fit so well. And I did find that scholarship also commented on it. At least slow violence was mentioned a couple times. So afterwards I was like, I should have stuck with that. It is appropriate. But yeah, my mind has been on eco-criticism for a little while now. So archives were new to me, like as far as archival study. But pairing them together has just kind of made a lot of sense considering our future and where we are and what projections of like scientists are making projections of climate change. So the fact that literature can do that too, I think is just as valuable.
I guess this is for both of you. It's kind of a generic question, but what, like during your research, is there like anything that you would like you read and you were like, oh my God, was there something that really, I don't know how else to say it, like, was there something that you were researching it, like, the way that I said that I was researching and I was like, oh my God, I have to do this, like was there something that made you think that, did that come across coherently? My brain is turned off.
That made sense.
It did?
That made sense.
Okay,
It
cool.
did. Did you want to go first? Did you want me to go first?
So you're saying what did we have something in the novel themselves
Like,
interested us?
Your research, like,
Oh,
is
or the
there
research?
there's something that you were really like taken aback by or taking interest in, or you know what I mean?
I was pretty familiar with a lot of the
Yeah.
things that I found in my research, to be honest. Some of them did offer different perspectives, but I saw like Tracy Alamo's transcorporeality involved. And so I was familiar with a lot of these other terms, but it was just, I guess, really validating is what was interesting. The fact that I could use this discourse that already exists to my ends was interesting.
Oh, and then me. Okay. I was like, Mary, what are you staring at? So actually mine started in an article which I do write about in my essay, my larger work, but I didn't have the time, nor could I really find the right flow to address it in the presentation. And it was basically all about, it was examining young adult dystopian fiction, specifically Divergent, which I love Divergent, and I do always say that is a utopia right there, not a dystopia. I'll die on that hill. But it was saying that all of these dystopian fictions that came out in the 2012, in the post Harry Potter Hunger Games era, so Divergent, The Selection, Crossed by Ali Kandi, all these really great, or really Maze Runner, like all of this stuff, specifically feminist YA dystopian fiction, because a lot of these were geared towards young women or had teenager protagonists. The author started off the article by saying that, hey, the goal of these young adult dystopian stories is to empower these young women and to help them through adolescence and into adulthood by empowering them through literature. And then the author totally flipped it on its head in the latter half of the essay and said, but it doesn't accomplish it. It might be the function, but it is not the end result. And the end result is this vapid, shallow glimpse into what adults and even like male adults in a lot of cases, I'm sure we've all seen the Tumblr text post like her breasts bounced boobily or whatever, you know, to describe how male authors write women in fiction, but a lot of them fail at female empowerment, and so they actually harm the reader in the long run. And so I was really fascinated with this concept, and that's kind of what set me down this path of, you know, what happens when a function fails.
Kind of along those lines, I was really struck by, appreciated the final "so what." Do you see feminist speculative fiction or speculative fiction more broadly as having, like, is it doing something unique in its relevancy, or is that relevancy just sort of true for literature, art more broadly, in terms of, like, I wrote down like that it's relevant, right? It's displaying cultural and political anxieties. Is that, you kind of see in terms of, is there something that's highlighted more in speculative or feminist speculative fiction, or is it kind of true for maybe literature more broadly?
Hey, question. Next question. No, I do think that speculative fiction has and this kind of goes along with Alexis' presentation as well. But I do think that because of the nature of speculative fiction, that and that the general goal seems to be, you know, sending a message to society, but also critiquing current society. I think that's what makes the genre particularly valuable, because, you know, especially with all this like book banning going on, textbooks being rewritten, all of this stuff, you can rewrite all of that, and you can ban books, but you can't unwrite them. And those were written by people who really lived. And I think if you juxtapose like Red Clocks, for instance, or even Future Home of the Living God, maybe less so Severance, just because it became realized. But you know, these were all reactionary pieces to what was happening around them. Meanwhile, if you look at things like A Court of Thorns and Roses, you know, like fantasy, or even romance. If you look at the Jafar X Jasmine story I'm reading right now, that says less about the current society we live in, I would think, I hope, than I think something that is actively critiquing and commenting on society.
I think tonight's discussion, you know, thinking about both panels, and one connection I was thinking then with Alexa, your paper, was the idea of agency. And so the scholars, you pointed out, tended to use the word swallow, myself included, right? The text itself curates, which I think in like swallowing is sort of an involuntary like we just sort of we do it, not necessarily like not necessarily thinking about agency in regard to it. Does the Amargosa have agency, or is it possible to curate an archive and have those external forces actually determine the curation? Does that make sense?
Yes.
Like it's more of a tool. I'm thinking, Mary, of the way in which children can be turned into a tool. Is the Amargosa an agent? A tool?
I think it's both. I think it, you know, it lacks consciousness, obviously, but I actually just revisited a passage today that I had forgotten about. And it says that sometimes it swerved around certain terms or moved really slowly, giving people time to escape, which I, you know, hadn't really considered as much before because we had talked about agency. So I think that itself is doing like a dutiful record keeping of anthropogenic climate change, but it does have some kind of intention in what it's curating. And so I like to think of it as that it is intentionally curating this story and these records to archive this history, future history.
Yeah. And as you're speaking, I'm also thinking about the critique of anthropomorphism.
Yes.
And the way in which that would be like a possible counter argument, right? That the novel is simply engaging, it's like giving animals human characteristics. Anytime we characterize something that's inanimate, there's that problem that it becomes human-like as opposed to the thing itself.
Sorry.
But so I don't offer that as necessarily like, but as a possible counter argument that to think about.
I hadn't really thought of anthropomorphism, but I thought about anthropocentrism and how the Dune Sea kind of pushes against that, which flips, the fact that this is human-induced climate change, and now we have this personified abiotic earth medium has come and pushed back against humans for what they've done.
I was actually going to say that because you brought up the idea of agency. So I was gonna say exactly that. It's like the humans kind of push towards this disaster, and we ultimately have the agency, and it's like they almost gave the agency to the sea, like the dune. And then in turn, the dune now has all the agency, whereas humans are stripped away from this agency. So now it's like this uncontrollable like thing that humans have no say over. And so now it's like they brought on their own disaster. That's its own
which plays into postmodern power structures and how we can interrogate power structures that have been upheld structurally, institutionally, and kind of reconfigure who has power, what does power mean, and how do we reclaim power.
I can't think of a better note to end class. And our presentation, let's say. Thank you, Professor King, for joining us.
Bringing literature over one day in the future.
And this.
It was my pleasure, and it was great to hear all of their ideas. I missed some of the first ones because I was driving, but thanks for letting me listen.
Thank you for listening.
Thanks for joining. Have a good evening, everybody. And please take some snacks. Don't forget your swag. Good night, everybody.
Seminar swag. Good night, everybody.
Bye.
Good night, Kristen.